Viviane Morrigan lives and works on land belonging to the Wongal people of the Eora Nation located around the inner west of Sydney. She has now retired from her last full-time job as a lecturer at the University of Queensland Ipswich campus, where she was responsible for setting up and running courses on the cultural studies of science and technology within the Centre for Contemporary Studies. She first became politicised in her early 30s when she became involved in Women's Action Against Global Violence, a member of the national umbrella group Women for Survival, and while carrying out postgraduate work at the University of Sydney. Soon after, she was elected the first women's officer for their postgrad association. It was during this time that Viviane committed herself to a lesbian feminist identity, which she has maintained passionately and proudly ever since. She is the Secretary and Public Officer of COAL, the Coalition of Activist Lesbians, and a member of L40, a social group for lesbians in New South Wales. She is also a contributor to a radical feminist book critiquing porn bots, sex robots, due for publication this year, and her writing has benefited from regular meetings over the past couple of years with inspiring members of the FATES, Feminist Academy of Technology and Ethics, convened by Kathleen Richardson in the UK, who leads the campaign against porn robots.
I was first politicised in my early 30s when I became involved in a women's peace group. At the same time, I began postgraduate work at the University of Sydney, none of which is involved with the transgender issue now. At that time, I was elected secretary of the Postgrad Association, as Janet said, and a new friend I'd made in the department was elected president. She was a radical lesbian feminist who years later, I learnt to my surprise, had converted to Christianity. This happens, people's political positions change enormously over a lifetime. Soon we were able to hire a female organiser with far left politics. We were very left identified then. The next year I was hired as the first women's officer for the Postgrad Association, and we held the first National Women's Postgraduate Conference. In that year, my postgrad work ended when my supervisor tried to stop my voluntary work with the Postgrad Association. I was unsuccessful in appeals to the VC, mediated by the university's first women's officer, and I left my research project as my funding was tied to my supervisor, a professor whose power could not be challenged. Over those 2 years, I gained a valuable on-the-ground political education, which stands in good stead for me today. It was also then that I committed myself to a lesbian feminist existence, which I've maintained, as Janet said, which I've maintained passionately and proudly. Since then, despite recent efforts by some lesbians I've met in online Facebook groups to cancel me because of my heterosexual past. I'm currently the Secretary and Public Officer of COAL, which is a UN-accredited NGO. I'm also a contributor to a radical feminist book critiquing porn bots or sex robots, due for publication this year. And my writing has benefited by regular meetings over the past couple of years with the other contributors, inspiring members of FATES, the Feminist Academy of Technology and Ethics, convened by Kathleen Richardson in the UK, who leads the campaign against porn robots.
What made you first realise that transgenderism is a threat to children and women?
When I joined COAL a few years ago and realised how important it is politically to resist gender ideology and politics, because it represents the new men's rights movement and backlash against feminist gains in improving the position of women. In particular, gender ideology has already undermined many hard-fought-for rights of lesbians and other women and girls. An early example was the fight that some lesbians in Adelaide had to stop men who identify as women and lesbians, in other words, heterosexual men, from attending a lesbian-only function. The women avoided a court conviction and a fine, but like many other lesbians under the reign of gender ideology, we've had to be very careful since then not to publicise our events. Right now, I'm keenly researching the tentacles of the lurking LGBTI forces of money and influence to expose the extent of their misinformation and underhand tactics. One recent example is the report titled Manufacturing Moral Panic, Weaponizing Children to Undermine Gender Justice and Human Rights. Oh, such a progressive kind of title, isn't it? And it was put out at the middle of last year by the Global Philanthropy Project. That organisation boasts it is internationally recognised, and these are quotes, as the primary thought leader and go-to partner for donor coordination around global LGBTI work, unquote. It is a collaboration of 22 funding organisations, and it's obvious we're up against well-funded organisations skilled in strategising. Jennifer Bilek has followed gender ideologies, money and influence trail in her blog called The 11th Hour and in other online articles that provide us with valuable resources.
Is there an area of activity where you're focusing your efforts?
Because of the COVID epidemic and my health issues, most of my activism is online and in writing. As an individual, I'm a member of many gender-critical online activist groups where I'm also making valuable links with others and forming new friendships. I support women here and overseas who are suffering because they've expressed gender-critical views. For example, I've made small donations to their fundraisers to cover their legal costs. I don't have a lot of money, but I do what I can. My collective efforts mainly focus on the National Committee of COAL, where I contribute to writing submissions and reports. COAL is critical of gender ideology, especially as it affects lesbians of all ages. And we're currently re-establishing a webpage where we hope to communicate more widely to lesbians and about lesbians' concerns and ideas for fighting back against gender ideology. Gender ideologues have realised that gender-critical arguments about child protection and injustices in women's sports, particularly, are winning over majority opinion. And the MMP report from last year demonstrates this. In fact, it invents a new term called gender restrictive groups as an alternative to TERF. And I've seen some groups already using it. The MMP report, like the similarly deceptive Yogyakarta principles, is designed to confuse and obfuscate in order to set a gender agenda. The report uses discourse capture, even in the very subtitle, twisting gender-critical discourse into an attack on our concerns about young girls, many of whom are lesbians, and being induced to turn body hatred originating from patriarchal social conditions into gender dysphoria, and then offering them so-called solutions of seeking medical professionals to mutilate their bodies and prescribe them hormones for the rest of their lives. These are morally repugnant effects of gender ideology, but our concerns are hardly a moral panic, as the report says, which implies illogical and unreasonable reactions. The MMP report attacks the term gender ideology that admittedly has been mobilised by conservative, faith-based and authoritarian forces, but gender-critical feminists have, perhaps unfortunately, adopted the term, although it has certainly helped us to form coalitions with other such groups. The report largely provides an in-depth description and analysis of groups like ourselves and our tactics who oppose gender ideology. So it's interesting to read our enemies' thought processes. It also discusses 3 case studies in Peru, Bulgaria, and Ghana. Perhaps this is to prove its social justice credentials, despite being based and funded in the West. There's an attack on the Declaration of Women's Rights. On the Declaration of Women's Rights as the product of, quote, TERFs. So suddenly they can use the term TERFs, who have, quote, co-opted the language of human rights and specifically women's rights, portraying it as, quote, a weapon against gender justice and particularly trans and non-binary people's rights. All this progressivist language that they've borrowed from people like us. In this war of words for heart and minds, we need more female-centred, clever strategies that don't depend on pots of money and male power and influence.
Can you tell us a little bit about the opposition you're facing and how this is impacting you?
I haven't suffered much personally for expressing my gender critical views publicly because of my age and having no concerns about a career path anymore. I'm open about my views. However, my two nieces in their early 20s have both disagreed with me and become quite upset, in tears even, but thankfully still communicate with me. I think they may have unfriended me or just don't read my Facebook posts, however. I work one day a week teaching English online to international students and have had a small amount of input into an organisational committee that aims to empower women. Apart from dealing with the fraught politics of pronouns, my recent concern was to ensure that a new policy on menopause support included the keywords sex and women, which had been completely excluded. The main visible expression of my opposition against Cole's political efforts has been mainly one that I have experienced, has been mainly one of disregard by our opponents. We need to step up our lobbying efforts, clearly, which of course require a lot of energy that many of our ageing second wave feminist members find demanding. Our webpage presence, however, has the potential to increase opposition to us, but at the same time, I'm hopeful it will also make more connections with lesbians who will be helped by us and will work with us to fight back against gender ideology and improve the lives of lesbians.
What are the next steps for you and Cole? Do you have any suggestions for attendees?
My and Cole's next steps, besides continuing to respond to unexpected metaphorical bombs thrown at lesbians by gender activists, are to support the contemporary surge in interest in lesbian feminist principles and action. I will continue to work with the Cole webpage committee to support our blog page, as well as to help develop many of our other pages that are coming. Cole will hold another event at the UN Women's CSW Online NGO Forum. God, the UN goes in for these big, long names. And that's going to be held in the second half of March this year. Last year, we networked with WDI, which was then known as WHRC, whose forum event there featured women from across the globe sharing their evidence of the harms that gender identity ideology had caused in their countries. However, their exhibit booth and handbook advertising the WHRC were removed from the platform because of alleged offensive comments that were definitely not made. In addition, some WHRC women were removed from a CSW event where participants were promised an opportunity to, quote, speak up and amplify our voices from all corners of the world. Well, their voices certainly weren't amplified. There was only one other specifically lesbian identified group participating in last year's CSW. I went through the whole program. There were, however, LGBTQI events, which I didn't find out about until later for some reason. It was my first experience at the CSW forum. It probably would have been political suicide anyway to participate in them, as that might have threatened the success of Cole's event. One of these other LGBTQI alphabet soup events was called, quote, an agenda for inclusion and realization, voices of marginalized communities, that was sponsored by some LGBTQI groups, which included ILGA, a pernicious group that is heavily active with the UN Human Rights Council and is currently promoting a so-called feminist declaration to compete with the Women's Declaration. UN Women has become a dangerous forum for women, where gender ideology has taken a stronghold that must be broken. Cole would very much like to increase our input into improving the lives of lesbians and expanding our membership to be more inclusive. I would encourage any Australian lesbians watching and listening tonight to apply to become a member. The proviso is that you have gender critical views. Simply email us at Coalition of Activist Lesbians @gmail.com to ask for an application form. Membership rates are very reasonable, a sliding scale from $5 to $25. and you'll need to provide the name of a proposer who is known to Cole already. We have heard of efforts by LGBTQ activists to infiltrate our group. I heard an allegation just the other day. And we are careful to protect our organisation and our membership from the unethical and bullying tactics of those pushing gender ideology.